hated the day. The day was a miserable day. I mean, it was a...
Really? I thought...
Well, was it? Well, I can tell you now, it was the worst royal engagement I ever did. You know, I thought to myself, you know, this is all showbiz rubbish. You know, the whole thing was just stage managed to suit them. Worst royal wedding I ever did. He was angry, and I felt, you know, we were punished for that. To offend our queen, like he did in that book, you know, it really upset the king. And you know, I don't think he could easily forgive that. And I imagine the king's had strong words with him over it.
Arthur Edwards has just dropped a bombshell on what really went.
The cameras clicked, the voices hushed, and in the middle of it all was Arthur Edwards, a man who had spent nearly 5 decades chronicling the public and private lives of Britain's most powerful figures. Yet tonight, Edwards was not holding his camera, nor was he hiding in the shadows of a palace hallway waiting for a fleeting royal moment. Instead, he was the one on stage, recounting with a startling bluntness what he described as one of the great bluffs of modern politics unraveling before the world's eyes. His target, Donald Trump. His subject, tariffs, power, and Canada's unlikely emergence as a strategic winner. Trump's meltdown, Edwards explained, had not come suddenly. It had built over months, shaped by his instinctive belief that tariffs were a weapon of control, a tool that could bend nations, allies, and rivals to his will. He spoke of Trump's confidence, his characteristic swagger, and the belief that by threatening to shut off access to American markets, others would simply cave. But as Edwards told the gathered audience, the gamble had misfired. Not only had the bluff failed, it had backfired spectacularly, leaving Canada, long dismissed as a quiet neighbor, holding a strategic advantage Trump could not have anticipated. The story, Edwards began, was one of minerals. Ordinary people, he said, might think of tariffs in terms of lumber, steel, or cars, but the real battlefield lay underground, in lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements. These were the building blocks of electric cars, smartphones, and advanced weapon systems. The very foundation of 21st century power. Trump, in his quest to force concessions from allies, had underestimated just how crucial Canada's resource base had become, and how swiftly Ottawa could pivot when pushed to the edge. Edwards spoke slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of his words sink in. He painted the image of a White House increasingly frustrated by its inability to force Canada into submission. Trump had escalated tariffs on steel and aluminum, believing Ottawa would beg for relief. Instead, Canada struck back with targeted measures and, more importantly, with a strategic redirection of its economic planning. Edwards leaned forward as he recounted how Canadian officials began framing their response not as a defensive maneuver, but as an opportunity to seize a global advantage. They accelerated mining approvals, struck deals with European partners, and poured resources into developing domestic supply chains for the very minerals the world was beginning to covet. The turning point, Edward claimed, came when Trump realized that his tariffs, rather than crippling Canada, had pushed it closer to Washington's rivals. With the United States desperate to secure non-Chinese sources of critical minerals, Canada suddenly found itself at the center of global negotiations. And instead of being cornered, it was dictating terms. Edwards' voice took on a sharper tone as he described the moment Trump finally lost his composure. Insiders, he said, recounted a private meeting in which the former president slammed his hand on the table, raging that Canada had made him look weak. This was the meltdown Edwards referenced, the breaking point when bluster gave way to fury, when the reality of losing leverage to a supposed junior partner became undeniable. But the real intrigue of the story lay not just in Trump's anger, but in how Canada turned the crisis into a win. Edwards outlined in detail a series of moves that transformed Ottawa's position. There were high-level meetings with European Commission officials, whispered conversations with German automakers desperate for secure lithium supplies, and quiet but consequential investments from South Korean battery manufacturers. Each step was deliberate, each designed to show that Canada was no longer merely a resource exporter at the mercy of American markets, but a strategic player with global options. In the reportive cadence he had mastered through years of royal coverage, Edwards compared Canada's maneuver to a chess game. Trump, he said, had assumed he was a king, the dominant piece dictating the board. But Canada had played like a patient queen, moving diagonally, strategically, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when Trump advanced recklessly, Canada countered not by defending but by seizing control of the center. The audience leaned in as Edwards wove his narrative, blending economic analysis with a human drama of power politics. He spoke of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, often ridiculed by Trump, finding a moment of unexpected resolve. He described ministers who, under pressure, began speaking with an urgency that reframed the national conversation. Instead of asking how to survive Trump's tariffs, they asked how to build resilience, how to use a crisis to force innovation. Edwards did not shy away from the theatrics of Trump's behavior. He described the former president's tweets, the late-night rants, the dramatic declarations that America was being cheated. But he also emphasized how, beneath the bluster, there was a genuine strategic loss. For the first time in decades, Washington realized that its northern neighbor held the keys to resources critical for future technologies. And rather than keeping those keys quietly in America's pocket, Canada was dangling them on the global stage. At one point, Edwards broke from his usual reporting tone and spoke personally. He recalled his years photographing the royals, watching how power was exercised not in shouting matches but in subtle gestures, in carefully orchestrated moves. What struck him, he said, was how Canada had adopted a similar approach, outlasting, outmaneuvering, and ultimately outshining a figure who believed sheer force was enough to secure obedience. The meltdown, Edwards suggested, revealed something deeper about Trump's worldview. It was not simply that he underestimated Canada, but that he misunderstood the nature of modern power. In a world where supply chains stretched across continents and where the future depended on rare minerals, the old tools of tariffs and threats could only go so far. Canada, by turning its natural resources into strategic leverage, had demonstrated that resilience and foresight could trump bluster and bravado. Edwards went further, tracing the global ripple effects. European capitals, once wary of relying too heavily on Canada, now began shifting policy. Automakers from Munich to Milan sought deals in Sudbury and Saskatchewan. Japanese and South Korean officials, anxious about China's dominance, courted Ottawa with offers of long-term partnerships. And in Washington, officials who had once dismissed Canada as a dependable but secondary ally now scrambled to rebuild trust, fearful that Ottawa might lean too far toward Europe or Asia. Every scene Edwards described carried the weight of inevitability. Trump had played his hand, certain he could strong-arm his neighbor. Instead, he had pushed Canada into a stronger, more independent position. It was, Edward concluded, one of the rare moments in geopolitics where the underdog had not only survived but had come out ahead.